fraud and stolen babies. South Korean adoptees seek justice after numerous accusations of malpractice. Mia Lee, Sorensen's Danish parents, used to tell her that her birth family in South Korea had put her up for adoption. According to her adoption papers, she had been born prematurely in 1987 to people who could not afford her medical bills and who wished for her to have a good future abroad. But when Ms. Sorensen found her birth parents in South Korea last year, they were astonished that she was alive. They told her that her mother had passed out during labor and that when she had awakened, the clinic told her that the baby had died. South Korea has the world's largest diaspora of inter-country adoptees, with more foreign adoptions overall than any other nation. About 200,000 children have been sent abroad since the end of the Korean War in 1953, mostly to the United States and Europe. Those adoptions continue today, even though the country has one of the world's lowest birth rate. In 2021, the top intercountry adoption hubs were Colombia, India, Ukraine, and South Korea. Before the coronavirus pandemic began in 2020, China topped the list. Amid widespread accusation of corruption and malpractice in the past, South Korea opened its first official government investigation into its adoption industry last year. South Korean families have long been reluctant to adopt children, despite government campaign to encourage domestic adoption. And in the decades after the Korean War, when South Korea was an impoverished country with poor medical services and threadbare welfare budget, there was a pressing need to find adoptive homes abroad for orphaned, abandoned, or disabled children, according to adoption experts. Many children found the help and caring homes they needed abroad, but in its rush to promote overseas adoption as a solution, South Korea also spawned profound and widespread problems in the industry that persisted for decades. Profit motives for adoption forms created an incentive to falsify or obscure documents to make the more children available for adoption, sometimes without the birth parents' knowledge. Many unwed mothers were coerced into signing away their babies even before giving birth, and sometimes there was little or no follow-up from the forms on cases in which children struggled with adjustment troubles or abuse in their new homes. Many of the problems have diminished in recent decades, and South Korea has taken steps to overhaul its adoption practice, including expansion of government support for single mothers who wanted to keep their children, and requirements that overseas adoptions be approved by the courts. But numerous accusations of malpractice from earlier decades went without investigation. The push for accountability has been led by hundreds of adoptees who have returned to South Korea in recent years with the time and the resources to seek the answers. They have worked with a new generation of researchers and politicians willing to shed light on a painful legacy that was, for decades, considered too shameful to openly discuss. It's like the human trafficking Ms. Sorensen said of adoption in South Korea. If this happened to me, how many others did they do this to? One ethnic people. During the pandemic, Peter Moller, a Korean adoptee raised in Denmark, asked fellow Korean adoptees around the world to share their experiences. He expected to learn of isolated cases of document fraud. Instead, hundreds of people came forward with accounts of fabricated data, stolen babies, and laundered identities, and of using adoptive families. We only scratched the surface, said Mr. Moller, who helped organize the global adoptee campaign that prompted the government to the investigation. The baby export biddings in South Korea began with what critics called a deep-seated xenophobia and the prejudice against biracial children. In its post-war years, the country's first president, Seungman Lee, pursued a policy he called one state for one ethnic people, which encouraged sending biracial children born to American soldiers and Korean women to their father's land. Many destitute mothers of biracial children faced a stark choice: place their babies up for overseas adoption or raise them alone in poverty and disgrace. When Poo Chung-ha, a retired adoption agent, joined Halted Children's Services, the country's largest adoption agency, in 1967, his first job was to persuade women working in the sex trade around the American military bases to place their biracial children up for overseas adoption. Our society didn't care for them and their mothers, he said. Mickey Woo Flippen was born in 1965 to a Korean mother and a black American soldier. She said that when she left the small alley where she lived in a home with her mother and biracial siblings, people hurled racist insults at her. We had no future in South Korea, said Ms. Flippen, who was adopted into a family in Oregon as a teenager after her mother died. In South Korea, it was long left to parents to report the birth of a new child, a practice that adoptees may say made it easier to leave newborn babies unregistered with the government and to pass them up as orphans who were then preyed upon by adoption agencies. Mail-order babies. By the end of the 1960s, most children sent abroad were not biracially but born to unwed mothers, and the target of prejudice in South Korea. Around that time, as many as 20 babies would arrive at Holt from across the country every Friday, said Mr. Boo, who headed Holt's Korean operation until 1978. Some had no information on them, and the doctors had to guess their age from their teeth, he said. Others had been abandoned and starved for days and died soon after arrival. They were buried in a plot owned by Holt, with neither their births nor deaths registered with the government. He said that during his time at Holt, the agency did nothing illegal. We sent children overseas so they could have better medical care and homes, Mr. Bush said. Another aim, at least for the government, was to alleviate the country's bloated post-war welfare rolls. To streamline the adoption process, South Korea allowed for private agencies, including Holt, to earn fees by sending adopted children abroad. Even as South Korea's war-torn economy began to improve, the country continued to promote adoption. In the 1970s, the country briefly considered paging out overseas adoptions after North Korea accused it of selling babies to foreigners. But in the 1980s, it further liberalized inter-country adoption, this time in the name of promoting immigration and private diplomacy. References to South Korea as a baby exporter and to mail-order babies became popularized in international media and have since stuck. A booming business. In 1985, 8,837 South Korean children were sent abroad for adoption, 6,021 of them to the United States. For each baby, adoption agencies collected a $3,000 to $4,000 facilitating fee from the adoptive family, as well as airfare, and separated $1,450 adoption fee, according to internal government documents from the National Archives, which were reviewed by the New York Times. South Korea's per capita national income in 1988 was $4,551. To help keep business humming, the agencies ran or subsidized shelters for unwed pregnant women, where the women were asked to sign an agreement to relinquish their babies, according to a report published in January by the National Human Rights Commission. Lawmakers at the time began to worry that adoption agencies had become human trafficking centers, according to one of the government documents that described the meeting between welfare ministry officials and the agencies. Another document quoted the presidential office as warning that the agencies focused on making profit and handed out cash and gift to clinics and the orphanages that served as adoption brokers. Holt said these adoption fees were approved by the government. It also said that it processed adoptions based on information provided by orphanages and other institutions. When it received babies directly from parents who had not registered their children's births, the agency said it was allowed by law to treat the children as orphans. Korea's Social Service, another adoption agency, declined to answer questions for this article. But in letters to adoptees, that were reviewed by the Times. The agency admitted that some of his paperwork had been invented. You'd be very confused, the agency said in one such letter to Anja Patterson, admitting that her adoption paper had been falsified. When Miss Patterson was sent to Denmark in 1976, she was an orphan named Lee Yun Kyung. 3 decades later, the agents told her that her actual Korean name was Sun Yun Ju, and that when she was put up for adoption by her uncle without her father's permission, that girl's name and papers had been used. Miss Patterson eventually found her biological family in South Korea, but when she asked the agency about the real Lee Yun Kyung, she was just told that the baby had died. There was no record about death or her biological parents. She only existed in Miss Patterson's Danish middle name Lee. Searching for answers, the news media in South Korea often highlight the successes of Korean adoptees abroad, but those who have returned in recent years describe being haunted by question of identity and belonging. William Allen said when he was adopted by an unmarried American businessman, his papers listed him as an orphan, but he said he now struggles with lingering childhood memories of visiting a rural market in South Korea with his mother and being dragged away suddenly by a stranger. Investigators plan to release their findings by the spring. They do not have the power to prosecute any of the agencies, but the government is required by law to follow their recommendation. Adoptees confront a nation's painful past.